The New Jedi Order has always been one of my favorite parts of Star Wars, but almost as interesting as the content of the series for me is the context of how it was developed. The NJO series, while focusing on Luke's Jedi Order, has Luke and the rest of the Jedi struggling to identify what the Order is and how it should operate. And part of that struggle was because the old order was only just being developed in the prequel trilogy at the time. The authors didn't really know what the Jedi Order used to look like, and that lack of knowledge is kind of projected onto Luke as well. Some of that is a little weakened by the fact that he was basically surrounded by people who were actually in that order, but a lot of that was developed later. The Phantom Menace was released in May of 1999, while Vector Prime, the first New Jedi Order book, came out in October of that same year. So most of the series was written with only the knowledge from the original trilogy and the Phantom Menace available to the authors. It was a 19-book series, so there was still a handful of books being released after Attack of the Clones. Troy Denning, one of the authors in the NJO, he wrote Star by Star, the longest book in this series, confirmed that they didn't get any advanced knowledge of what was going to be coming in the future films. So the ones writing pre-Attack of the Clones didn't know what Attack of the Clones was going to have in it, and none of them knew what Revenge of the Sith was going to be. Today, though, I wanted to talk about a different connection or parallel I picked up on between the New Jedi Order and the prequels, a comparison between the Trade Federation army in The Phantom Menace and the antagonists of the New Jedi Order series, the Yuuzhan Vong. This chiefly comes through with the Battle of Dantooine and Dark Tide Onslaught, one of the opening battles of the Yuuzhan Vong War, and how it mirrors the Battle of Naboo in The Phantom Menace. While the similarities between the battles themselves stuck out to me most while reading the book, what the battles say about the two factions is, in my opinion, pretty interesting as well. Just for some clarity here, I'm going to refer to the Trade Federation as part of the CIS throughout this video, even though that's technically anachronistic. The CIS is, of course, more than just the Trade Federation, and it didn't exist yet as of The Phantom Menace, but the points I'm talking about apply pretty equally to them, so it's just easier to refer to the CIS as a whole, rather than continuing to jump back and forth between CIS and Trade Federation. It also leaves me more options for the thumbnail, and that's what we're really here for after all. The Yuuzhan Vong were a species of extragalactic aliens who invaded the Star Wars galaxy in 25 ABY, or years after the Battle of Yavin, striking from Helska 4 in the galactic north and successfully conquering much of the Rim before breaching the core and even taking Coruscant. They'd been spying and prepping for their invasion for decades, if not centuries or even millennia, having been driven from their own war-torn galaxy after killing off almost every species in it, save for themselves and the Chazrak, a reptilian species kept by the Yuuzhan Vong as slaves. The Yuuzhan Vong had their own pantheon of gods, and the ideas of pain and honor played foundational roles in their society as essentially symbols of their connection to and origins from their gods. Key among their beliefs, especially when it came to their goals within the Star Wars galaxy, was a complete revulsion for mechanical artificial technology, especially artificial life forms like droids, which were seen to be imitations of and an affront to the gods' creations of life. Instead, the Yuuzhan Vong grew and used organic, often sentient life forms to serve as everything from communications devices to their largest warships. Not unlike the dinosaurs in the Flintstones, but very few Vong warships would look at the camera and say it's a living. The demographics on this channel make me unsure how many of you will actually understand that reference, but hey. This technological revulsion had roots in a major war in their own home galaxy, between two powerful droid factions, the Silentium and the Abominor. The Silentium originally appeared in the form of Vufi Ra from the Lando Calrissian adventures, and the Abominor originally appeared in a 1982 Empire Strikes Back comic named Rust Never Sleeps. Sort of. They're mostly identified with a character named the Great Heap in Star Wars Droids. The Yuuzhan Vong drove off both the Silentium and Abominor after the war between the two brought them to the homeworld of the Yuuzhan Vong, Yuuzhan Tar, and they left the Vong as essentially the unquestionable power in their home galaxy once driven off. So it's an interesting bit of cultural and religious history we have, where we're both told the end beliefs with what we're shown in the New Jedi Order series, and then these later source books or reference materials show us the event which impacted the shaping of these beliefs. So with this revulsion to technology, it would seem that the Yuuzhan Vong would be polar opposites of the CIS, an almost entirely droid-centric faction. But the ways in which they're portrayed in and around the Clone Wars for the CIS and the Yuuzhan Vong War for the Yuuzhan Vong have some interesting thematic similarities. The Battle of Dantooine, a plains-covered world not unlike Naboo, was one of the earliest battles of the Yuuzhan Vong War, happening about 2 months after the initial invasion forces landed in the galaxy. Refugee convoys from the nearby worlds of Dubrillion and Destrillion were forced to stop at Dantooine, assisted by Lando, Luke and Leia, Mara Jade, and the Solo children, some of whom had come with the refugees and others who had been on planet for a variety of reasons. Unbeknownst to at least most of them, they'd landed directly in the path of the Yuuzhan Vong invasion corridor. Much like the Gungans and Naboo security forces, the refugees and Jedi were forced to fend for themselves against an overwhelming invasion force. The New Republic was still somewhat dragging its heels on involvement, despite pleas from Leia and other supporters looking to help relieve the onslaught and the refugee crisis in the Outer Rim, and warning that the core would be under threat in the not-too-distant future. This was all kind of reminiscent of her mother, Padme Amidala, and her own pleas to the Republic Senate for assistance against the threat of the Trade Federation before the CIS began their own full assault on the Republic. The Trade Federation and other mega-corporations had been allowed to prey on the outlying systems for profit for years, which I've covered in some other videos, with minimal political appetite in the Republic for pushback. The biggest question to ask with any political enterprise in the Star Wars galaxy is, does this currently impact the core? If not, who cares? In the Battle of Naboo, the primary forces of the Trade Federation army were battle droids, controlled from orbit by a central processing system within the Lucre Hulk droid control ship. The structure of the Yuuzhan Vong forces, despite their revulsion of technology, is much the same. Their army included independent Yuuzhan Vong warriors, but the bulk of their overwhelming forces were made up of slaves, primarily Chazrak, which were controlled by a large, beetle-like organism called a thrall herder. These Yuuzhan Vong thralls were very similar to the droids, though far more brutal and arguably more mindless, or less mindful. Despite their view of mechanical technology as being an affront to the will of the gods, they essentially stripped these living beings of their agency for the purposes of the Vong war effort, though this too was done in the name of their gods. So it wasn't really the experience of the living that mattered for the Yuuzhan Vong worldview, it was more the fact of life existing itself as a creation. Notably, they also believed their knowledge was pulled from things called cortexes, directly granted to them from the gods. In reality, they were another example where past experience of the Shapers who grew their tech being recorded and granted divine providence. We're kind of seeing the Yuuzhan Vong at the end of a long cultural decay. Like the early droid armies and the forces on Dantooine, most Vong battle coordination throughout the war in general was handled by a centralized quote-unquote computer, a tactical overseer entity known as a Yammisk, which effectively told individual ships and warriors what to do at any given point, including liking this video and subscribing for more. It became a common goal within the major battles of the Yuuzhan Vong War to take out ships carrying Yammisk, and covert ops would often make immature Yammisk a prime target. So, as with Anakin's destruction of the droid control ship on Naboo, the victory of the New Republic over the Chazrak and Yuuzhan Vong forces comes from an assault on the Thrall herders. As the Clone Wars approached and progressed, the droid forces became less centralized and more independent, but there were still similar elements present, and it's again important to remember that The Phantom Menace was the only prequel movie out for the majority of the New Jedi Order's run. So I don't know if I can really point to this as an intentional reference, but it's certainly at least a neat parallel in my opinion. More important than these parallels in terms of the actual events of the battles with the two factions are the thematic underpinnings which they represent. While in many ways the Yuuzhan Vong are seen as a departure from previous enemies, they still do cover a lot of similar themes. Star Wars has always associated its villains with some kind of loss of identity and control. We can see this with the Stormtroopers as the helmeted, faceless foot soldiers of the Empire, while the Rebel Troopers are pretty much always going to have their faces visible. This makes you a lot more likely to get shot in the face, but it's also more sympathetic, and it's not like the armor was doing much good for the Stormtroopers anyways. In Episode 1, the same goes for the Naboo and Gungans on one side versus the droids as a uniform, unthinking, and unstoppable army of enemies. The clones also fit into this to some extent. They're the quote-unquote good guys of the Clone Wars in one sense, but they're as much a warning of what was to come as the droids were, and so they were just as symbolic of the political themes and social themes George was trying to write about as the droids are. A big part of shows like the Clone Wars giving them some personality and agency themselves involves taking off those helmets. A further parallel comes in with the idea of the villainous faction being the result of an unseen entity, playing them against their own best interests and desires, stoking their worst instincts, and promoting conflict from behind the scenes. In the Clone Wars and the original trilogy, the source of this is of course Palpatine and the Sith, although in the original trilogy there's less of the behind-the-scenes machinations, it's more of an open conflict between the Rebels and the Empire. In the Yuuzhan Vong War, this is the work of agents like Nama Nor, and spoiler alert for an actual twist, chiefly Onimi, the pet or familiar of Supreme Overlord Shimra, who is in reality the true leader of the Yuuzhan Vong, and who claims to have access to a set of information known as the 8th Cortex, which would give the information the Vong need to beat the infidel inhabitants of the galaxy, furthering the belief that their conquest was not just righteous, but mandated by the gods. Shimra, as Onimi's puppet, and Onimi himself knew this not to be the case. So within the Yuuzhan Vong, you have this element of them being taken advantage of, while within the New Republic, or the galaxy as a whole, Yuuzhan Vong agents are often present in disguises, kind of undermining any efforts at unity. The Yuuzhan Vong and the New Jedi Order have always been a contentious part of Star Wars lore, and while I'm a big fan of the NJO as a result of it being one of my first introductions to the expanded universe, and Star Wars as a whole really, I understand why for some it is somewhat jarring. But if you look past some of the tone, it is a bit darker than other Star Wars media, especially the Bantam books from before it, which may not be for everyone, you can see that a lot of what makes Star Wars is still very much baked into its DNA. I again wouldn't go as far as saying which parts are or aren't intentional about these parallels, but these kind of connections, intentional or not, have always been one of the most interesting parts of Star Wars to me. I hope you've enjoyed the video, thank you for watching, consider leaving a like or subscribing for more if so, turn on the notifications if you would like to know when new videos are released, special thanks to the patrons and channel members who make these videos possible, and to Marmar for editing this video.